Imagine standing in the grand marble halls of the Doma in Rome, circa 64 AD. The air is heavy with a sense of tension, charged with a metallic tang of fear. From behind the gilded doors, the faint sound of a lyre being plucked fills the air, its eerie melody drifting above the screams that echo from the streets below. Inside, the emperor is seated in his private theater, his swollen fingers gliding over the strings of his instrument, indifferent to the chaos outside. As flames consume half the city, he watches with a quiet pleasure, his eyes gleaming with the satisfaction of an artist observing his finest work. Yet, his masterpiece is not the one on stage. It is the destruction unfolding in the homes of thousands of people. This is no ordinary night. Tonight, Rome succumbs to the flames, and the emperor celebrates his art in the ruin of the city. Before we dive deeper into these lost stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy uncovering the untold truths of history, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more content like this. Also, leave a comment below to let me know where you're tuning in from. It's fascinating how we can delve into these ancient stories from various corners of the world, linked across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. The man who would become one of history's most infamous figures was born as Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, and later he was adopted by Emperor Claudius and given the name Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus. However, to him, names were meaningless, only the spotlight mattered. From an early age, Nero showed an intense obsession with performance, which would go on to define his reign and ultimately lead to the downfall of an empire. He didn't just desire to rule, he yearned to be immortalized as the greatest artist who ever existed. When Nero ascended to the throne in 54 AD, at the tender age of 17, Rome had hoped for a leader who would mature into his role. Instead, they got a ruler who treated the empire like his personal stage. As emperor, Nero's vanity and obsession with art became legendary. He forced senators to attend his lengthy poetry readings, which could last for hours on end, sometimes more than 8. Guards were posted at every exit to ensure no one could escape. Those who dared to fall asleep during his performances were dragged out of the room, feigning death to avoid his infamous wrath. Nero's reign was marked by extravagance and cruelty, as his thirst for recognition and adoration became a destructive force. His desire for fame overshadowed the responsibilities of leadership, and the empire would soon pay the price for his misguided ambitions. Others would fake childbirth during his performances, knowing that only giving birth was seen as a legitimate excuse to leave. However, Nero's true obsession was with theater. He performed something so outrageous in public that it shocked the Roman elite. Emperors were gods, not entertainers. But there he was, sweating under the stage lights, his voice cracking as he sang tragic roles, his face covered with the masks of both heroes and villains. He also participated in chariot races, manipulating the results so expertly that he once won a 10-horse race, even after falling off his chariot. While ancient accounts differ on whether Nero started the fire himself, what is indisputable is his response to it. The flames ravaged the city for 6 days and 7 nights, but Nero saw it as an opportunity. He staged a private performance, showcasing his own compositions. The sack of Troy, filled with costume changes and theatrical gestures, unfolded as citizens perished in the streets beneath. Subsequently, Nero would transform the cleared land into his golden palace, a sprawling complex covering about 300 acres in central Rome. The palace included an artificial lake and a massive 120-foot bronze statue of the emperor himself. Nero's obsession with performance also seeped into his personal life, leading to equally shocking actions. In 65 AD, in a violent outburst, Nero kicked his pregnant wife, Poppaea Sabina, to death. Soon after, he married a young man named Sporus, whom he had castrated to resemble his deceased wife. He forced Sporus into women's attire and made him his bride in a formal ceremony that included a dowry and wedding veils. But this wasn't enough for Nero. He went on to marry another man, Pythagoras, in an elaborate ceremony where Nero took the role of the bride, wearing a bridal veil and participating in a traditional wedding night. Nero's reign, however, came to a bitter end in 68 AD. Rebellions erupted throughout the empire, marking the conclusion of his rule and the end of his theatrical performances. As enemy forces neared Rome, Nero found himself unable to meet death in the traditional Roman way, by the sword. Instead, he spent his final moments writing poetry and rehearsing dramatic death scenes. According to the historian Suetonius, Nero's last words were, "What an artist dies in me." Even in his final moments, he could not escape the need for attention. From the ashes of Nero's Rome, we shift to the year 2118 AD in Syria, where a new young emperor would soon emerge, one whose excesses would make Nero's appear almost restrained. Elagabalus, originally named Bessianus, ascended to the throne at the tender age of 14, aided by his grandmother's political maneuvering. However, unlike Nero's focus on art, Elagabalus was consumed by an intense religious fervor and a penchant for shocking sexual experimentation, actions that would disturb even the most disillusioned members of Roman society. Elagabalus, a fervent worshipper of the Eastern sun god, Elagabal, introduced this foreign deity to Rome with extreme zeal. He built a grand temple dedicated to the sun god on Palatine Hill, compelling the Senate to watch as he performed bizarre and extravagant rituals. He danced around the altar in flowing silk robes, his face adorned with makeup, lost in religious ecstasy as he castrated himself. Roman historians recount how he performed this act of self-mutilation and compelled others to do the same, transforming the sacred rites of Rome into spectacles of Eastern mysticism. However, as unorthodox religious rituals were just the beginning, Elagabalus went further by exploring his gender and sexual identity in ways that caused scandal across the empire. He made public appearances dressed in women's attire, complete with makeup and jewelry, and even sought out physicians to turn him into a woman, offering them large sums for the procedure. His marriages were equally unconventional. He wed both wives and husbands at the same time, blending Roman and Syrian traditions in his ceremonies. One of his most infamous relationships was with Heracles, a former slave and chariot driver, whom he married. This marriage was viewed with shock, as the emperor adopted the role of wife while addressing Heracles as his husband. In private, he would wear women's clothing, fully embodying his chosen rulers. His actions not only challenged Roman customs, but also shocked the moral sensibilities of those around him, as he dismantled traditional views of gender and sexuality in his court. Elagabalus's behavior stirred controversy and outrage, especially with the way he blurred the lines between societal roles, religious practices, and personal identity. His reign became synonymous with defiance of Roman norms, leaving a legacy marked by scandal and rebellion against established traditions. The emperor was known for his striking appearance, often painting his eyes with cosmetics and removing all his body hair, presenting an image of femininity that seemed beyond belief. He was said to have run a brothel directly from the imperial palace, personally engaging with clients and collecting payment for his services. His reign, lasting a mere 4 years, was marked by extreme behavior that shocked the Roman populace. During his brief time in power, the emperor made several questionable decisions that forever altered Roman society. He promoted his lovers to high-ranking positions, regardless of their qualifications. Among his most infamous appointments was a chariot driver whom he made prefect of the Praetorian Guard, the emperor's elite personal security force. He also elevated a former slave to be his chief advisor, while dismissing experienced senators and military generals. The Roman elite watched in horror as the emperor dismantled their ancient traditions. This chaotic rule led to a widespread sense of fear and disgust, with the foundations of Roman society beginning to crack. The emperor's actions were seen as an attack on everything the Roman aristocracy held sacred. His reign seemed to be an act of deliberate destruction, and the Roman people could do little but watch as their once proud empire faltered under his leadership. In 22 AD, the emperor's rule came to a brutal end. The Praetorian Guard, under the command of his own grandmother, Julia Maesa, assassinated the 18-year-old ruler. His body was dragged through the streets of Rome before being thrown into the Tiber River. The Senate then ordered his name to be erased from all official records as part of the Damnatio Memoria, a punishment meant to erase any trace of his memory. Despite this effort, history would remember him as one of the most bizarre and controversial figures in Roman history. The descent into the madness of unchecked power found one of its most notorious examples in Caligula, born Gaius Julius Caesar, Augustus Germanicus, and his infamous nickname, Caligula, meaning little boots, came from the miniature military footwear he wore as a child during his time among Roman soldiers. But this innocent moniker stood in stark contrast to the monstrous ruler he would become. When he took the throne in 37 AD, the Roman people celebrated, relieved to be free of the paranoid Tiberius. Yet they had no inkling they were stepping from one dark reign into an even more terrifying one. At first, Caligula's leadership seemed promising. He reinstated democratic elections, released those imprisoned for political reasons, and generously rewarded the Praetorian Guard. However, later that same year, he was struck by a severe illness that marked a turning point in his reign. When he finally recovered, he was drastically altered, his behavior erratic and disturbing. While some scholars point to temporal lobe epilepsy or possible poisoning as the cause, the specific illness was secondary to the consequence. Rome now had an emperor who sincerely believed he was a divine being. One of the first signs of his growing delusions was his bizarre interactions with statues of the gods. Servants at the palace recounted strange and unnerving scenes of Caligula having extended conversations with marble idols, particularly that of Jupiter. On several occasions, they even found him shouting furiously at the lifeless figure, as if caught in an intense theological debate or a cosmic argument with the heavens. These acts of divine madness were only the beginning of his unraveling. As his delusions intensified, so did his cruelty and unpredictability, turning the Roman Empire into a theater of fear and grotesque spectacle. The people who had once cheered his rise soon realized they were living under the rule of a man who had lost all sense of human reality, seeing himself not as a ruler, but as a god above all judgment. He would drape a cloth over the statues' heads whenever lightning struck, thinking Jupiter was attempting to intimidate him. To make visits to his divine counterpart easier, he constructed a bridge connecting his palace to the temple of Jupiter. Guards often reported hearing him laugh and converse with unseen companions throughout the night. However, it was Caligula's cruelty that set him apart from mere madness. He forced senators to run beside his chariot for miles, delighting in their exhaustion as they collapsed. He compelled elderly nobles to participate in gladiatorial contests, taking pleasure in their struggles to lift their weapons. At one banquet, he suddenly broke into laughter. When his guests inquired about what had amused him, he replied, "I just realized that with a single word, I could have you all killed." The atmosphere in the dining hall immediately shifted, and the laughter died away. His treatment of his horse, however, became the stuff of legend. Caligula went so far as to construct a marble stable for the animal, complete with an ivory manger and purple blankets. He made a horse a priest, and even he constructed a makeshift bridge made of boats across the bay, traveling back and forth for days. During these excursions, he would throw Roman citizens into the water whenever they failed to cheer loud enough. The endeavor drained the treasury, yielding no results except for satisfying his craving for dramatic displays. In 41 AD, his reign came to a violent end when Cassius Charia, a Praetorian Guard officer whom Caligula had repeatedly degraded, orchestrated a plot against him. They trapped the emperor in a subterranean passage beneath the palace and stabbed him 30 times. To prevent any possibility of succession, his wife, sister, and infant daughter were also killed. The Senate tried to reinstate the Republic, but by then the Praetorian Guard had already declared Claudius emperor, quashing any hope for the restoration of freedom. From the marble halls of Rome, we now travel to the windswept plains of the Mongol Empire, where Genghis Khan, born Temujin around 1162 AD, would unite the nomadic tribes through a ruthlessness that made Roman cruelty seem almost civilized. His most peculiar trait was not just his military strategies, it was his chilling obsession with biological warfare and psychological torture, which reflected a mind that was as meticulous as it was ruthless. Genghis Khan's journey from an isolated tribal outcast to the ruler of the largest contiguous empire in history was rooted in a simple yet brutal philosophy: total submission or total destruction. However, the methods he employed to impose this philosophy were far from straightforward. He mastered the use of terror as a weapon, employing it to shatter the will of his enemies long before the use of firearms became widespread. One of his most disturbing tactics was the calculated deployment of plague victims as instruments of war. This practice came to the forefront during the 1347 siege of Kaffa, when Mongol forces launched plague-infected corpses over the city walls using catapults. This was among the earliest recorded instances of biological warfare. However, it wasn't an idea conceived by Genghis Khan himself. Rather, it was a tactic he had perfected based on techniques he had learned and refined in earlier years. Khan's military innovations didn't stop there. His armies would often gather diseased animals in human bodies, preserving them in specialized carts that followed his troops into battle. These carts became part of the terrorizing machinery, and the use of the plague as a weapon was as methodical as any of his military tactics. His ability to wield fear, both psychologically and biologically, set him apart from all other leaders of his time. In the end, Genghis Khan's legacy was not only defined by the sheer scale of his empire, but also by the chilling efficiency with which he used terror, disease, and psychological manipulation to control and defeat his enemies. When attacking heavily fortified cities, the Mongols employed a gruesome tactic, using massive catapults to hurl rotting corpses into the enemy strongholds. This not only spread deadly diseases, but also instilled fear and panic among the defenders. The psychological impact of such assaults was devastating, as it demoralized entire populations even before the Mongol army arrived at their gates. The Great Khan's personal habits were equally disturbing. He firmly believed that washing would strip him of his spiritual strength, so he seldom bathed and ordered his soldiers to avoid hygiene as well, especially during military campaigns. As a result, the Mongol army moved through the Asian continent like a swarm of uncleaned bodies. Their pungent odor often preceded them by miles, and enemy scouts could track their movements simply by following the smell. This deliberate filth, Khan believed, enhanced the fearsome reputation of his warriors, making them appear more formidable and spiritually potent. His understanding of psychological warfare went beyond conventional military tactics. When conquering new lands, Khan's treatment of the local population reflected his mastery over the human psyche. Skilled craftsmen and engineers were spared, but anyone taller than the width of a wagon wheel was executed without hesitation. The slaughter of the adult male population was followed by a cruel method of psychological control. Children, left orphaned by these massacres, were forced to witness their parents' death. These traumatized children were then incorporated into Mongol society, trained to become psychological weapons themselves. The horrors they had endured were turned into tools of terror, to be used in future campaigns, ensuring that fear would spread long after the Mongols had left. Genghis Khan's approach to sex was notoriously violent and ruthless. He maintained a vast harem, housing thousands of women, but his real obsession lay in humiliating the families of his enemies. His primary target was the wives and daughters of enemy leaders, whom he would systematically rape in front of their families. This act of cruelty was not just for personal gratification, but was a tactic of psychological warfare. He believed that degrading the men of the conquered tribes in this way was a more effective means of control than simply killing them. The survivors, filled with fear and humiliation, would spread stories of the Khan's brutal acts, creating an atmosphere of terror that spread far beyond the battlefield. The Khan's forces were instructed to bring back the most beautiful women from every city they conquered. These women were not sought out for Genghis Khan's own pleasure, but were seen as trophies, symbols of his domination over the enemy. The practice was not just about power, but about sending a clear message of his superiority and the futility of resistance. Every act was designed to break the will of the people he defeated and to remind them of his unchallenged authority. Genghis Khan's death in 1227 AD remains shrouded in mystery. Several accounts offer different explanations for his demise. One theory suggests that he succumbed to injuries sustained after falling from his horse. Another, more intriguing account claims that he was killed by a captive princess from the Tengut tribe who had hidden a blade during an assault. Despite these varying explanations, the exact cause of his death remains uncertain. His burial remains one of history's greatest mysteries, as his followers went to extreme lengths to protect its location. Anyone who witnessed the funeral was killed, and more than 800 individuals perished to keep his grave a secret. Their bodies were scattered across the surrounding area to prevent anyone from following the trail, ensuring that the location would never be uncovered. Vlad III, known as Vlad the Impaler, was born around 1431 AD in Wallachia, a region in Eastern Europe. His rise to notoriety would eventually link his name with terror, inspiring the infamous legend of Dracula. However, his life was far more horrific than any tales spun by writers. Far from random cruelty, his actions were part of a calculated strategy aimed at establishing dominance and control. Vlad's ruthless methods were not driven by simple sadism, but were carefully crafted psychological tools to strike fear into both his enemies and his own people. Vlad's descent into cruelty began during his childhood, which was marked by a brutal period of captivity under the Ottoman Turks. Between 1442 and 1448 AD, he was held hostage in the Ottoman court, where he witnessed firsthand the harshness of the regime. The Ottomans, skilled in using fear as a means of control, utilized executions and torture as part of their rule. Vlad keenly observed their methods, learning the art of terror that would later define his reign. By 1456 AD, Vlad ascended to the throne of Wallachia, drawing from his traumatic childhood and his time among the Ottomans. He employed terror as a means of asserting his authority. His strategies were not mere imitations of what he had seen. They were brutal innovations. Even his former captors, the Ottomans, would be horrified by the extreme methods Vlad used, which included mass impalements and other grotesque punishments designed to instill fear throughout his realm. His reign is marked not only by ruthless violence, but also by a shrewd understanding of human psychology. Vlad the Impaler's terror tactics ensured that both his enemies and his subjects feared him, giving him a grip on power that lasted through the turbulent years of his rule. Far from just a legendary figure in folklore, Vlad's real-life reign was one of calculated cruelty and fear, a testament to the extremes he was willing to go to maintain control. Impalement became Vlad's signature execution method, though he elevated it into a cruel form of art. Victims were stripped of their clothing and then forced onto sharpened stakes. These stakes were meticulously arranged to avoid hitting vital organs, ensuring the victim's suffering would last for hours or even days. Gravity would slowly drive the wooden shaft through their bodies, and the process was excruciatingly prolonged. Vlad himself often remained amidst the victims, watching their agonized faces as they slowly succumbed to their wounds. His most notorious act occurred in 1459 AD, when he impaled over 20,000 Ottoman prisoners near the city of Targovish. The forest of stakes extended for miles, with the bodies meticulously arranged according to height and social status. This horrific spectacle was meant to showcase his ruthless power. Vlad set up his dining table at the center of this gruesome display, holding diplomatic meetings while surrounded by the slowly dying victims. The air around the impaled prisoners was thick with the stench of death, and the agonizing moans of the victims filled the air. Ottoman envoys who came to negotiate with Vlad were unable to concentrate, as the horrific sounds and smells made it impossible to focus. This was precisely the effect Vlad desired, ensuring that no one could question his dominance or power. This gruesome method of execution, combined with his chilling psychological tactics, solidified Vlad's reputation as one of history's most feared rulers. Impalement was just one of the many methods in his psychological arsenal. He had a particular habit of inviting his enemies to dinner, only to have them seized and tortured in front of their own families. On one occasion, he invited several hundred nobles to a grand banquet, sealed the doors, and set the building ablaze with everyone inside. To those who survived, he coldly explained that he was simply cleaning the weeds from his garden. His brutal tactics were well known, and those who managed to escape spread word of his atrocities, making his reputation a weapon that marched ahead of his armies. Vlad's private life was as cruel as his public persona. He married twice, and both of his wives had been previously wed to men he had murdered. His first wife's name has been lost to history, but it is believed that she chose to end her life by leaping from the castle tower rather than fall into the hands of the Ottoman forces. His second wife, Ilona Salaji, endured a life of constant dread due to his unpredictable nature. Court records tell of her jumping at any sudden noise and refusing to eat food that hadn't first been tested by her servants, a reflection of her deep-seated fear of him. Though Vlad's reign was marked by unimaginable cruelty, his personal life was equally grim. His brutal acts were not limited to his enemies. His family, too, suffered under his reign of terror. His wives lived in perpetual anxiety, trapped in a world where survival often depended on avoiding his wrath. Whether at the dinner table or in the royal chambers, fear was the constant companion to those around him. His legacy is one of ruthless control, a man who used terror, not only on the battlefield but in every facet of his life. His methods of instilling fear, from impalement to psychological warfare, were so effective that they became legendary, etched into history long after his death. His name has lived on as a symbol of terror, one that continues to evoke horror and fascination to this day. The ruler's fixation on hygiene stood in eerie opposition to his brutal actions. He bathed several times each day and constantly wore freshly laundered garments, as if attempting to cleanse himself of the atrocities he committed. His insistence on purity extended to his palace, where servants were executed for failing to uphold his impossible standards of cleanliness. Inside his fortress, guests noted the surreal contrast between the pristine interiors and the horrors just beyond the walls. The dining chamber gleamed with fresh floor coverings and spotless table settings, while outside, the rotting corpses of his enemies on stakes polluted the air. Despite the carnage, not a speck of dirt was tolerated within his halls. In 1476 AD, during a clash with Ottoman forces, Vlad's reign of terror came to a gruesome end. Deserted by his own noblemen who could no longer bear his savage rule, he was left vulnerable in the fray. The Ottomans decapitated him and sent his head to their sultan in Constantinople, where it was mounted on a spike, an ironic demise for a man notorious for impalement. Though his body was laid to rest in a monastery, the monks concealed the burial site, fearing that even death might not contain his malice. Whispers persisted that his malevolent spirit could rise again, bringing with it the same dread that had once shrouded his blood-soaked reign. From the blood-soaked battlefields of Wallachia, we journey across the globe to the blazing deserts of the Aztec Empire, where Azuma the Say, born around 1466 AD, stood as a ruler over millions. His reign was defined by a combination of deep religious devotion and a brutal ceremonial practice that made the monarchs of Europe seem almost meek in comparison. Azuma's most peculiar obsession, however, was not his famed collection of exotic animals, but his fixation on human sacrifice. This practice was for him a sacred form of communication with the divine, executed with such ritualistic exactness that it suggested a mind utterly consumed by religious fanaticism. Azuma rose to power in 1502 AD, assuming the title of the ninth Aztec emperor. He ruled from Tenochtitlan, a city of grandeur so breathtaking that Spanish conquistadors would later claim it was more magnificent than any European capital. The city's beauty, however, masked a dark reality. It was a civilization built on the foundation of ritualized human sacrifice. Azuma, who wore two crowns, one as priest and one as emperor, oversaw these ceremonies that took the lives of thousands of his subjects each year. As emperor, Azuma's power extended far beyond the military and political. It was intertwined with religion. His ceremonies, performed at the heart of Tenochtitlan, were meant to appease the gods and ensure the prosperity of his empire, that they also reflected a deep paranoia and a relentless desire for control, as he believed that only through bloodshed could he maintain the favor of the gods. The brutal spectacles, which became a hallmark of his rule, were not merely for political dominance. They were rooted in a religious zeal that consumed both him and his people. His reign, marked by death and grandeur, would leave a legacy that echoed across history as one of the most extreme forms of religious devotion and imperial power the world has ever known. The emperor's day would begin well before the break of dawn with a ritual that involved bloodletting. He would use obsidian blades to pierce various parts of his body, his ears, tongue, and even his genitals, collecting the blood in jade bowls as offerings to the gods. Observers noted that he would enter a trance-like state during these acts, speaking to unseen deities and receiving cryptic guidance on how to proceed with the day's tasks. His servants, dutifully collecting every drop of blood, believed that it held divine power capable of controlling the weather and ensuring a bountiful harvest. Azuma's zoo was infamous across the empire, showcasing a wide range of exotic animals in intricate enclosures. However, his most disturbing collection wasn't that of animals, but of human beings. He curated a living menagerie of dwarfs, hunchbacks, and those with various physical deformities, whom he displayed for visitors and used in his religious rituals. These individuals were treated as living sacrifices, their unusual appearances thought to make them more pleasing to the gods. They were an integral part of the emperor's ceremonies, fulfilling a role far beyond that of mere spectacle. The emperor's practices and the strange collection of individuals he kept were central to his reign. The belief that his blood could influence the elements and bring prosperity to his people gave him an almost godlike aura. His authority extended beyond the throne, as he was seen as a mediator between the gods and the mortal world. Yet in his pursuit of divine favor, he crossed boundaries that many would find repulsive, using the most vulnerable in his society as objects of ritual and display. Despite the horror of his practices, Azuma's reign was marked by an air of mystical power and influence. His subjects feared him, yet they could not deny the prosperity his blood offerings seemingly brought. In his mind, the cruelty was justified by the benefits it promised, and the strange practices continued, blending religious devotion with a chilling obsession with control and power over life and death. He frequently had prisoners executed during significant festivals, removing their hearts while still beating. The emperor's eating habits were deeply rooted in his religious belief. He consumed only foods that had been blessed by priests and tested by food tasters, not for poison, but to ensure spiritual purity. He believed that eating impure food would anger the gods and bring calamity upon his empire. His meals often consisted of chocolate drinks mixed with human blood, especially from sacrificed children, which he thought amplified his divine strength. Spanish chroniclers noted that he drank this concoction while witnessing executions, his gaze becoming glazed as he entered a state of religious ecstasy. Azuma's treatment of prisoners was widely ridiculed, revealing the methodical nature of Aztec sacrifice. He oversaw extensive prison complexes where captives were carefully fattened for their eventual sacrifice. Their diet was meticulously controlled to guarantee their flesh would be pleasing to the gods. Each step of the process was designed to ensure that the sacrifice was perfect, in line with the emperor's deeply held belief. The ritualistic killing of prisoners was not just a practice, but a significant part of the religious and political fabric of Aztec society. He personally chose victims for major ceremonies, inspecting their bodies for physical perfection and signs of divine favor. Those selected for sacrifice were treated as honored guests up until their execution, adorned in fine clothes and given lavish meals during their final days. One of the emperor's most notorious ceremonies took place in 1487 AD during the dedication of the reconstructed Templo Mayor. Historical records suggest that more than 20,000 prisoners were sacrificed over a span of 4 days. Moctezuma took a hands-on approach, personally performing many of the executions. Using obsidian knives, he would cut out the still-beating hearts of his victims and present them to the statue of Huitzilopochtli, the god of war. The steps of the temple were stained red with blood, and the city was enveloped in the scent of death for weeks afterward. The emperor's deep religious delusion became evident when the Spanish conquistadors arrived in 1519 AD, led by Hernán Cortés. Moctezuma, convinced of his divine role, believed that he was the incarnation of the turning god, Quetzalcoatl, as prophesied in Aztec lore. His interactions with the Spanish further revealed the extent of his belief in this prophecy. Moctezuma's obsession with these ancient prophecies and his ruthless rituals underscored the intensity of his commitment to what he saw as divine destiny. His ceremonies, driven by religious fervor, were not just acts of sacrifice, but affirmations of his self-perceived divine status. He greeted the Spanish with grand ceremonies, presenting them with gold and precious gems, while his advisors warned him of the stranger's true intentions to conquer his empire. However, his devotion to religion clouded his judgment, leaving him vulnerable and ultimately a prisoner in his own palace. The circumstances surrounding Azuma's death in 15 Spanish accounts claim he was killed by stones thrown by his own people during a rebellion, while Aztec narratives suggest the Spanish were responsible for his death. What remains clear is that his religious zeal and failure to adapt to changing circumstances played a significant role in the downfall of one of history's greatest civilizations. The emperor who believed he could converse with gods was unable to recognize treachery when it was right in front of him. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic in France, we find Charles VII, born in 1368 AD. His reign, lasting from 1380 to 1422 AD, was marked by violent episodes of madness, which earned him the infamous title of Charles the Mad. The instability of his mental state led to periods of severe dysfunction within his kingdom, leaving France in a vulnerable position during his rule. Despite his struggles, Charles VI remained a figure of importance in European history. His reign saw the rise of internal strife, and his inability to govern effectively allowed others to step in and manipulate the throne. The history of these two rulers highlights the dangers of ignoring the changing tides of power, whether through excessive faith or mental instability. His strange behavior was not the calculated malice of other rulers. It stemmed from a mind that had completely detached from reality, creating a court filled with uncertainty, where courtiers never knew whether their king would embrace them or attempt to kill them. Charles VI's first major episode of madness occurred in 1392 during a military campaign in Brittany. While riding through the forest of Laman, he suddenly drew his sword and began attacking his own knights, killing 4 men before being subdued. Witnesses reported that he didn't recognize his own brother and screamed as though enemies were chasing him. This marked the onset of a mental decline that would plague him for the remainder of his reign. Throughout his episodes, Charles believed he was made of glass and feared that even the slightest touch would cause him to shatter. To protect himself, he had iron rods sewn into his clothing, refusing to let anyone near him. Physicians attempted various treatments, including using loud noises in an effort to shock him back to sanity, but these only worsened his condition. During his periods of insanity, Charles became erratic, sometimes behaving violently, other times retreating into a world of delusion where he could not distinguish between friends and foes. His court was filled with confusion and fear as the line between reality and his delusions blurred. No one knew what to expect from the king, and the court struggled to maintain order. Charles' madness severely impacted the kingdom. His mental instability led to a lack of leadership, and the ongoing turmoil made it difficult for his advisors and officials to govern effectively. Despite efforts to care for him, Charles' descent into madness continued, marking one of the darkest chapters in French royal history. He would spend long hours motionless, convinced that any slight movement would cause him to break apart. His delusions about his identity were just as troubling. There were times when he couldn't remember his own name and would claim that he was not the King of France, but a lowly servant named George. During these moments, he would refuse to bathe or change his clothes, believing that such luxuries were unfit for someone of his imagined status. On one occasion, he went without changing his clothes for 5 entire months. His clothes became so filthy that his servants had to cut them off while he was asleep. Charles's fear of his own existence began to extend to his family. He could no longer recognize his wife, Queen Isabella of Bavaria, and would become aggressive whenever she tried to approach him. He denied that his children were truly his own, insisting that they were impostors sent by his enemies. One day he locked himself in his chambers for weeks, convinced that his family was plotting to poison him. Despite their attempts to reach out, he only saw them as part of a sinister scheme against him. His paranoia intensified with each passing day, creating an atmosphere of constant tension. His behavior alienated him from those who had once been closest to him, further isolating him in a world of his own delusion. The royal court, once filled with the grandeur of a king's presence, became a place of fear and suspicion as Charles withdrew further from reality. Ultimately, his mental state deteriorated to the point where he could no longer function as the ruler of France. The kingdom, which had once thrived under his leadership, began to feel the effects of his unraveling mind. The legacy of a king was now overshadowed by the tragic story of a man lost to his own mind. He insisted that only one particular servant, whom he trusted deeply, could prepare his meals, yet even then he required the servant to eat first to ensure that the food had not been poisoned. As time passed, the king's obsession with escaping his own body grew, resulting in increasingly strange and erratic behavior. He would race through the palace halls, desperately trying to outrun his own shadow, believing it was a demon chasing after him. On one occasion, he tried to set fire to his chambers, convinced that the flames would cleanse him of the evil spirits tormenting him. The guards had to intervene, pulling him away from the fire, his hair and beard singed from the heat. During the rare moments when he was lucid, the king's suffering was even more unsettling than his madness. He would recall the terrible things he had done and become overwhelmed with guilt and anguish. For hours he would weep, begging forgiveness from those he had hurt and attempting to atone for his actions. However, these periods of clarity were fleeting, and before long he would sink back into delusion. Each time, the descent was deeper and the damage more profound. The political consequences of Charles's madness were disastrous for France. While he was incapacitated, The kingdom plunged into civil war, with two major factions, the Armagnacs and the Burgundians, fighting fiercely for control of the regency. The English, ever opportunistic, exploited the turmoil, seizing large swathes of northern France during the Hundred Years' War. However, Charles's insanity didn't just affect the court, it had devastating consequences for the entire kingdom. His mental instability nearly brought the realm to ruin. Charles passed away in 1422 AD, his mind shattered after 30 years of alternating bouts of madness. His son, the future Charles VII, faced the monumental task of reclaiming the lost territories his father's illness had cost. The legacy of the Mad King became a grim reminder. Royal blood offered no immunity to mental illness, and a ruler's internal struggles could become a national disaster. Moving from the troubled courts of medieval France, we now turn to 16th century Russia, where Ivan V, known as Ivan the Terrible, was born, and Ivan's reign would be marked by an extreme combination of paranoid delusions and relentless cruelty, making even previous tyrants seem almost benign in comparison. Ivan's reputation as a fearsome ruler grew as he unleashed terror across his domain, leaving a legacy of suffering and fear that would be remembered for centuries to come. His strangest compulsion wasn't his notorious outbursts of anger. It was a disturbing fixation on merging sacred rituals with acts of sexual brutality that exposed a psyche twisted by contradiction. At just 3 years old, Ivan ascended as Grand Prince of Moscow after his father's passing, but it was under the influence of the boyar nobles that his real education began. These powerful men, who acted as his guardians, used Ivan as a tool in their political struggles, pampering him one moment and tormenting him the next, based on their shifting agendas. As he grew, Ivan observed a chilling double standard. The same boyars who knelt before him in ceremony would later perform gruesome acts of torture on their enemies. This taught him that brutality was a legitimate and necessary expression of dominance. The young prince absorbed this perverse lesson deeply, shaping his views on leadership and control. By internalizing cruelty as power, Ivan began to craft his identity as a ruler shaped more by fear than by tradition or justice. At 13, Ivan demonstrated his independence with a horrifying display of authority. He commanded the execution of Andrei Shusky, a noble who had demeaned him, but it wasn't a simple execution. He ordered Shusky to be thrown to hunting dogs, then watched as the animals ripped the man to pieces. The savage act wasn't done in secret. Ivan made sure that the other boyars witnessed every moment, forcing them to acknowledge the brutal transformation of the boy they once controlled. This moment solidified Ivan's grip on power and sent a message that echoed throughout the aristocracy. It was a turning point not just in his personal history, but in the trajectory of Russian leadership, where reverence and violence intertwined in the hands of a ruler who had learned early that domination was forged through terror. Ivan's obsession with religious rituals formed a strange and unsettling contrast to his inherently violent nature. He would often spend hours on end in prayer, repeatedly bowing before sacred icons, his forehead striking the stone floor until it bled. Deeply immersed in religious texts, Ivan committed large sections to memory, able to recite them even in the heat of his most violent outbursts. Witnesses spoke of his erratic behavior, shifting between fervent prayers and brutal executions, as though he were trying to justify his cruelty to a higher power. This strange mix of devotion and bloodshed left onlookers in a state of constant confusion. The year 1565 marked a pivotal moment in Ivan's descent into madness, with the creation of the Opera China, a personal army made up of ruthless black-clad horsemen. These warriors bore strange symbols, a dog's head and a broom, signifying their grim mission to bite and sweep away anyone Ivan deemed a threat to his rule. The operchimics, as they were known, were given unfathomable power to torture and execute those suspected of treason, a list that gradually expanded to include most of the Russian nobility. This military force operated without mercy, fueled by Ivan's paranoia and an insatiable thirst for control. Ivan's political methods were as ruthless as his personal life. His sexual desires were deeply disturbing, mirroring the violence and unpredictability of his reign. His relationships, particularly those with women, were marked by brutality and exploitation, reflecting the same erratic cruelty that defined his leadership. Ivan's power over life and death extended beyond his political rivals. It bled into his intimate relationships as well, revealing a man whose warped psyche knew no bounds. As time passed, Ivan's paranoia deepened. He surrounded himself with loyalists who reinforced his belief that everyone, including those closest to him, could betray him. His growing distrust led to the persecution of entire families, and his capacity for cruelty only expanded. The once celebrated ruler of Russia had become a tyrant, consumed by madness, driven by a need to control, punish, and ultimately destroy anyone who stood in his way. I'm sorry, but I can't assist with that request. The final years of Tsar Ivan I were characterized by a growing sense of paranoia and an increasing obsession with religion. Despite his violent and oppressive rule, Ivan took monastic vows, believing that this would purify him from his sins, while still allowing him to maintain his authority. He wore a hair shirt beneath his royal attire and spent long hours in prayer. However, these acts of devotion seemed to only intensify his cruelty rather than temper it. Ivan's death occurred in 1584 while he was playing chess with a boy, Boris Godunov. He suddenly collapsed, possibly due to a stroke, though some historians speculate he was poisoned. His final words were said to be a prayer for forgiveness, but his legacy of terror lingered long after his passing, casting a dark shadow over Russia. After Ivan's death, Russia entered a chaotic period known as the Time of Troubles, which nearly led to the collapse of the state. Various factions fought for control of the throne that Ivan's paranoid reign had severely weakened. This instability threatened to unravel the foundations of the Russian Empire and left a scar on its history. Shifting from the frozen plains of Russia, we moved to the luxurious court of the Ottoman Empire, where Ibrahim the Cursed was born in 1615. He earned the nickname Ibrahim the Mad, largely due to his combination of sexual obsession and religious delusions. His reign would become one of the most eccentric and bizarre in history, marked by erratic behavior and uncontrollable impulses. The Ottoman Empire, known for its grandeur and power, would see this period under Ibrahim as one of its more unusual and unpredictable chapters. The contrasting rulers of Ivan the Terrible and Ibrahim the Mad highlight the complexities of leadership in the early modern world, where rulers' personal obsessions and mental states often shaped the fate of entire nations. While Ivan's reign plunged Russia into an era of strife, Ibrahim's rule became a spectacle of religious mania and indulgence, leaving behind a very different kind of historical legacy. His reign, which began in 1640 AD, was characterized by an insatiable desire for women and a deep disconnection from reality, nearly bringing down one of the world's most powerful empires. Ibrahim's descent into madness began early in life. As a child, he spent his formative years locked away in the palace's harem, a luxurious prison where potential heirs were kept to prevent any challenges to the reigning sultan. For 22 long years, he lived in this gilded cage, surrounded only by eunuchs and concubines, with little more than books and musical instruments to occupy his mind. This isolation from the outside world warped his perception, blurring the lines between fantasy and reality, pleasure and power. When Ibrahim ascended to the throne in 1640 AD, after the death of his brother Murad I, he was utterly unprepared for leadership. His first act as sultan was to order the replacement of his entire harem, believing that the previous concubines had been tainted by his brother's presence. This obsession with purging his surroundings set the tone for his rule, which was increasingly dominated by his uncontrollable impulses and whims. Under his reign, the empire teetered on the brink of collapse. Ibrahim's detachment from the real world led to erratic decisions that severely undermined the stability of his rule. He indulged in lavish excesses, focusing on the gratification of his own desires while neglecting the needs of his people and the demands of governance. The Sultan's obsession with women and pleasure became so consuming that he neglected matters of state, further isolating him from his responsibilities as a ruler. Ibrahim's lack of stability and irrational behavior would eventually lead to his downfall. His inability to rule effectively contributed to the weakening of the Ottoman Empire during his eccentricities and disregard for the empire's needs made him one of the most infamous figures in Ottoman history, a ruler whose reign was marked by an insatiable hunger for indulgence and a complete disregard for the responsibilities of power. Sorry, I can't assist with that. Palace servants reported that Ibrahim often isolated himself in his private chambers for up to 12 hours at a time, only leaving to eat or pray. His insatiable sexual desires led to frequent medical attention from palace physicians, who were called upon to treat him for exhaustion and dehydration. His behavior toward women was notorious. He had women sewn into leather bags and thrown into the Bosphorus if they displeased him, believing that drowning would cleanse their souls. On one occasion, Ibrahim ordered the execution of his entire harem, nearly 300 women, because he suspected one of them had been unfaithful. The mass execution, which involved drowning, took 3 days to complete. Palace guards rowed boats filled with struggling women to the deepest parts of the strait, where they were left to drown. His cruelty extended not only to his harem, but to the empire's financial stability. Ibrahim's lavish spending on luxury goods for his harem led to the empire's bankruptcy. He covered the walls of his private chambers with stable fur, an extravagant expense that surpassed the annual revenue of several provinces. Furthermore, he adorned his chambers with pillows filled with crushed pearls and imported rare perfumes from all over the world. His obsession with excess was so intense that it drained the empire's coffers and left it financially crippled. He ordered the construction of a throne crafted entirely from amber and had his bathing pools filled with a mixture of rosewater and milk. Meanwhile, his soldiers were left unpaid, and his people suffered from the crippling taxes he imposed. The Sultan's religious practices were as eccentric as his sexual fetishes. He convinced himself that his carnal desires were a divine calling, and fulfilling them was a form of devotion. Before entering his harem, he would pray, seeking blessings to enhance his physical endurance. He even hired religious scholars to write lengthy justifications for his actions, paying them vast amounts of money to find Quranic verses that could support his unorthodox lifestyle. Ibrahim's detachment from reality grew ever deeper. He became convinced that he was protected by divine forces, believing this would secure his victory in any endeavor, no matter how misguided. When he decided to lead an army into battle, he had no prior experience in warfare and had never witnessed a fight firsthand. Nonetheless, he felt confident that his celestial shield would guarantee his success. In preparation, he spent months having his concubines dress up as soldiers and perform staged battles in the palace gardens to train for the coming war. As his delusions escalated, Ibrahim's decisions grew increasingly erratic. His thirst for control and dominance seemed boundless, with no regard for the well-being of his people or his army. His obsession with luxury and personal gratification led to a complete breakdown in governance. The Sultan's subjects were left to suffer while he immersed himself in his extravagant desires. Even as his empire crumbled, Ibrahim remained consumed by his fantasies, unable or unwilling to acknowledge the harsh reality unfolding around him. Despite the mounting unrest, the Sultan's conviction in his divine right and invincibility only grew stronger. He believed that the world around him was simply failing to recognize his greatness, and that soon everyone would see his vision real. But as his reign continued, the signs of his inevitable downfall became increasingly clear to those around him. The deeper he sank into his delusions, the more distant he became from the world he was meant to rule. When advisors attempted to explain the harsh truths of warfare to him, he responded by having them executed, fearing their words might erode the confidence of the empire. His reign came to a tragic end in 1648 AD, when the Janissaries, the elite soldiers of the empire, could no longer tolerate his incompetence. In a violent outburst, they stormed the palace, dragging him from his private chambers where he had been hiding in fear with his concubines. Reports claim that even his own mother, the Valley's Sultan, authorized his death, deeming him a disgrace to the Ottoman dynasty. He was executed by strangulation with a silk cord, the customary method for the execution of Ottoman royalty, as his terrified concubines watched from behind their veils. From the luxury-filled chambers of the Ottoman court, we shift to the court of 17th century France, where Louis XIV, born in 16, known as the Sun King, Louis would revolutionize the concept of absolute monarchy, turning it into a strange, theatrical spectacle driven by his obsession with ceremony and control. His reign, spanning from 1643 to 1715, was characterized by an obsession with ritualistic behaviors so extreme that it transformed every part of daily life into a theatrical production. Courtiers were reduced to mere unwilling actors in the grand illusion of his monarchy. Louis XIV's obsession with ceremony took root during his childhood, a period when his mother, Anne of Austria, and Chief Minister Cardinal Mazarin utilized intricate court rituals to assert royal authority during the Regency. The young king observed how every action, every word, and every moment was crafted to reinforce the divine right of the monarchy. He learned that each movement was a performance that bolstered his role as ruler. As he matured, Louis internalized this lesson so thoroughly that he could no longer differentiate between the public spectacle and his private life. His morning routine, known as the lever, was a key ritual, often taking up to 2 hours. A group of 24 courtiers performed specific roles in this elaborate ceremony. For example, one duke had the esteemed duty of drawing back the curtains of his bed, while a prince was entrusted with handing him his shirt. This highly choreographed morning event was just one of many that reinforced the king's absolute authority. Through these rituals, Louis XIV asserted his dominance, not just over his court, but over every aspect of his realm, ensuring that the entire court was perpetually reminded of his divine right to rule. Each movement followed a strict sequence, with attendees bowing at precise intervals and speaking only if spoken to directly. During the ritual, the king remained completely still, his expression fixed and vacant, resembling a carved idol being adorned by devoted followers. His meals were equally theatrical, turned into formal spectacles, where designated courtiers sampled his dishes, poured his wine, and handed him cloths with rehearsed precision. He insisted on eating in full view of others, considering it a monarch's obligation to be observed during such acts. Meals turned into royal exhibitions, where he devoured vast amounts, 4 steaming bowls of broth, an entire bird, generous portions of various meats, and an array of sweets, without ever abandoning his upright posture or composed demeanor. While he dined in near silence, members of his court were expected to remain on their feet, earning the length of each extended feast without complaint. The king's self-image was an obsession bordering on madness. He demanded constant attention to his appearance, from the intricate care of his garments to the elaborate styling of his hair and the flawless application of perfumes and powder. Each day began with a dressing ritual, as complex as a theatrical performance, with select attendants participating in the privilege of clothing their ruler. To him, the act of presenting himself both physically and ceremonially was as important as governance itself. His reflection was not just a mirror, but a measure of divine authority, and he cultivated that image with a fervor that surpassed reason, turning even the smallest detail of his life into a symbol of power. He spent countless hours each morning scrutinizing his reflection in mirrors, searching for any sign of aging or flaws. His collection of elaborate wigs, worth more than the annual income of most nobles, became his signature. Some of these wigs were over 2 feet tall, necessitating specially designed doorways in the palace to accommodate them. With over 1,000 wigs in his possession, a team of 40 wig makers worked tirelessly to maintain them, all exclusively dedicated to serving the royal household. Each day he changed his attire up to 6 times, a process that demanded a formal ceremony and strict protocols for both dressing and undressing. The meticulous construction of his personal appearance became his way of controlling the reality around him. He transformed a modest hunting lodge into one of Europe's most breathtaking palaces, but it was his creation of a court system that truly showcased his innovation. He reshaped the dynamics of power by turning the nobility into mere captives of ceremony. Every aspect of life at Versailles was meticulously regulated, with convoluted protocols that consumed the aristocracy's time and attention on meaningless rituals. This left him free to consolidate his absolute authority without challenge. Through these rituals, he maintained an intricate balance of control, ensuring that even the most powerful nobles were constantly distracted by trivial matters. His empire was one not just of wealth and grandeur, but of subtle, overwhelming dominance. Kakritik Trango, Ilay Dekrik Chunkin, Ken Mowa Anawing, Gremo Neve Epsichella Shijung Mawe Sim, Shingzi Siuze, Leshrutudu for Hoyode Zabide The Vinyang Menser Den Hunin, for Moulin Ne Kung Tuk Burgundy Tagayo Strong One Brule, Lever, Buseng Forgive Wa, Nimbabi Come Ready Chodan Kimawarale, Bafized Tos Batin Don Hovi, Untekenma Kachangai Mo Take Hut, Vitug Dun, Strong Kiloi Sitil, Konto Saint Simon Tegilai Shu, Ninagre Strong Truden Sensang Tula Ben Mim, They Vilev, Red Kuso, Mo Il Brule, Makonko sui chofo kor ze weather korho bi tigago sao clev, where li ting shao wa kun medu trang bing ki lang. Thui ken sing hok for Louis III, du Sweden young cat or kanile strong tro din. Dui ti katin yin chung fuk ben kad. Hajre bwe bwe mi. Den gay. Ani mwer kwane nai kum fetwano un shritun chet katin yin kura ong fetem java kanile strong tro. Adu verui sadin tun jadim hongja. Muddy mwer kwane del der kiso chek chev adu Sweden strong kro. Kong din. Kum heko cho cho shua se tudo ken he len sen merkwong so. Madame de Montespan, the king's most renowned mistress, was obliged to attend Mass alongside the Queen and partake in religious rituals while being publicly acknowledged as the king's lover. This peculiar arrangement fostered a court where adultery was not only accepted but institutionalized, often sanctified through ceremonial acts. Such a system blurred the lines between moral duty and public spectacle, leading to an environment of deceit and excess. When the king passed away in 1715 AD, it revealed the hollowness of his reign, which had been centered on spectacle and performance rather than substance. His rule had created a regime so focused on appearances that it lost sight of genuine governance. The kingdom, financially exhausted and with an aristocracy filled with discontent, had forgotten the principles of self-rule. In the wake of his death, the delicate structures that had propped up his reign rapidly crumbled, and within a few decades, this chaos paved the way for the French Revolution and the eventual execution of his descendant, Louis XVI. From the violent courts of Versailles, we travel across the English Channel to encounter Henry VIII, born in his reign from 1509 to 1547 AD, would come to be defined by his obsession with marriage and divorce, which not only split England from the Catholic Church, but also left a lasting legacy of fear. Henry VIII's volatile temperament and ruthless policies earned him a place among history's most feared rulers, cementing his legacy as a monarch whose actions reverberated across generations. This era of flamboyant rulers focused on their own desires and indulgences set the stage for political upheavals. As monarchs prioritized personal power and public image, they often neglected the stability and prosperity of their nations, leading to a shift in history where their lavish courts became symbols of eventual decay. His strange behavior went beyond just his 6 marriages. It was his repeated use of execution as a solution to his personal issues, making the Tower of London effectively his private divorce court. Henry VIII began his reign as a beloved prince, handsome, athletic, and admired by his subjects and European royalty. However, his inability to produce a male heir with his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, set off a psychological shift that would dominate his rule. This obsession with securing a male successor was more than just a political concern. It became a personal obsession that consumed him. His relentless desire to secure a male heir drove him to increasingly radical and destructive action. His break with Rome in 1534 over his divorce from Catherine showed the lengths to which he would go to fulfill his ambition. He proclaimed himself as the supreme head of the Church of England, not out of religious conviction, but driven by sexual frustration and a desperate need to control his destiny. In his zeal, Henry VIII systematically dismantled England's monasteries, seizing their wealth and land. Yet his most remarkable innovation was the way he used theological justifications to carry out personal vendettas. This manipulation of religious arguments allowed him to secure his desires while cloaking his actions in the guise of piety and righteousness. Henry they executed Thomas More, John Fisher, Hey hugzet uitinisa ko ing, Javi hover cho kong hun kriu ko ong do vego tong. Ve doju weka babo ko ong yum teyim amohing amag kunjindu tutum, dabila in bolin, kume ong elster jos banan, a kihun strong be babia schuster weka kabula unting a fenkuk, medunen toden ne te bia dat. Den Henry lai tusuk for minseo bako to, du se hong down ko chen min. Ong de chen king kut hong hing ko baber chosu chung eling, agesa ka chek for bao, ong to chek ong kut an men gote kunji, Elizabeth, ko ha biet hotel. Suthaido vertichet, gor Henry, fen angs hu sui gen, gor ching shin, tim biu trung yin, ong de drenen vokum bel fi, duo chen, gor ong bi lo lo et ten. Gamu ho toward demika quenma koterenra ong for bogiap gor ong fandendud gujetem kikshob. Va ong fan yue den kishibi kohak the kodu kuchingua. Suabutum lay for Henry Tamer qua kaferdin moriak, a kaferdin war hendong burlug, gor ong, for jeshus near kusing fendo chodandi, that, amak, Vinimur Kwane Shingbundu Nai Kunja Wanzin Kursum Kan Mekadum Suyu Kunlud Kor Ong Stromeka Domingakadu. Hingme Handun Tembo, Nalun Se Subto Tetras, Gor Hemri Tadursan Busong Gortsus e Hinark, in Monus e Vua, Beko Hung Magis de Sokla Undre Danong Biofi, for La Wadushun, Kongsus of Yong Queen says. Despite his physical decline, he continued to harbor the illusion that he was still the athletic and powerful prince of his youth. He commissioned portraits that depicted him as lean and strong, even as his actual body had become disfigured and plagued by illness. His paranoia intensified during his marriage to his fifth wife, Catherine Howard, when he uncovered her past relationships. Consumed by rage, he confronted her alleged lovers, but his wrath did not stop there. He ordered the execution of everyone who had known about her previous affairs, and failed to inform him, including elderly servants who had once worked for her family. The purge claimed the lives of dozens, all because a young woman had been sexually active before marriage. In the final years of his reign, Henry became increasingly isolated and ruthless. He slept with a loaded crossbow at his bedside, believing that assassins were hiding in the dark corners of the palace. To protect himself from potential poisoning, he had his food tasted by multiple servants and constantly changed his sleeping quarters. His reign, once marked by power and grandeur, had descended into a nightmarish blend of suspicion and cruelty. His courtiers lived in constant dread of his temper, fully aware that a single wrong word could lead to their execution. The execution block at the Tower of London had been worn down by frequent use throughout his reign. When he passed away in 1547 AD, it was due to complications from his obesity and infected leg ulcers. The religious figures he had once revered were wiped out during his split with Rome. He left behind a kingdom forever changed by his personal obsessions, a daughter who would go on to become one of England's most remarkable queens, and a legacy of terror that would cast a shadow over the English monarchy for generations. Moving from the English court, we travel to the rugged mountains of Wallachia, where we meet another member of the Dracula family, Radu the Handsome. Born around 1437 AD, he was the younger brother of Vlad the Impaler. While his brother's reign was marked by extreme cruelty, Ridu's own path was defined by an unsettling obedience to both the seasons and his captors. This peculiar submission led him to claim the throne of Wallachia, but in doing so, it also gradually destroyed his very soul. His reign from 1462 to 1475 AD was marked by political submission and cultural betrayal, establishing him as one of history's most psychologically complex leaders. Radu's transformation began during his childhood when he was held captive in the Ottoman court, alongside his brother Vlad. While Vlad embraced cruelty and resistance, Radu chose the path of accommodation and submission. This period would shape his future decisions and alliances. Radu converted to Islam, becoming fluent in Turkish and Arabic, which further solidified his bond with the Ottomans. His willingness to assimilate into the culture of his captors made him a favored figure at the Ottoman court. Sultan Mehmed II, recognizing Radu's potential, took him under his wing, but their relationship was not solely based on political alignment. Historical sources suggest that the connection between Radu and Sultan Mehmed II went beyond the typical ruler-vassal dynamic. The nature of their relationship, often described as intimate, played a significant role in shaping Radu's worldview and political strategies. His personal experiences with the Sultan became the foundation of his outlook on power, politics, and loyalty. Radu's physical beauty was another key element of his identity. Known for his striking appearance, he was described in Ottoman chronicles as exceptionally attractive, with fair skin and delicate features. His looks, combined with his charm, made him a popular figure at court, admired by both men and women, and contributed to his use of sexuality as a political tool. He utilized his striking appearance to amass power, reportedly becoming the Sultan's lover, while simultaneously maintaining ties with influential Ottoman figures. His beauty became the primary tool he used to navigate the political landscape, wielded with meticulous intent. When Radu ascended to the throne of Wallachia in 1462, he introduced Ottoman practices to his predominantly Christian kingdom. He constructed mosques in various cities, encouraged Turkish settlers to colonize the land, and integrated Islamic law alongside traditional Romanian customs. The resulting court in Wallachia was an unusual fusion of Christian and Islamic traditions, where Orthodox priests shared the stage with Muslim clerics. The ceremonies, a blend of both religions, bewildered and unsettled his people. The complexities of Radu's relationship with his brother Vlad further deepened the intricacy of their rivalry, a clash of philosophies and brutal methods. Vlad, notorious for impaling thousands of Ottoman captives, stood in stark contrast to Radu, who warmly embraced Ottoman settlers and their customs. Radu's reign was marked by contradictions. While he imposed Islamic practices, he remained within the cultural framework of Wallachian identity. His interactions with the Ottomans not only transformed the kingdom, but also demonstrated his adaptability in balancing two conflicting worlds. These actions brought him favor with the Ottomans, but alienated many of his Christian subjects, who struggled to reconcile their faith with the growing Islamic influence in their homeland. Despite the tension, Radu's court remained an arena where East and West collided, where Christian orthodoxy and Ottoman Islam were practiced side by side. His relationship with Vlad is remembered as one of history's most psychologically complicated sibling rivalries. While Vlad's methods were savage and blood-soaked, Radu's approach was far more politically calculated, using his beauty and alliances as tools to secure his place in history. They engaged in numerous clashes, with Radu commanding Ottoman troops against the forces led by his own brother. The emotional strain of these encounters deeply affected Radu, who was said to cry after defeating Vlad in battle. His heart was torn between allegiance to those who raised and empowered him, and the familial bond he still felt toward his sibling. This internal conflict left visible marks on his demeanor and actions. Radu's intimate behaviors symbolized his mental surrender to the culture and control of the Ottoman elite. He organized a harem that included both sexes, fashioned after the imperial palace's custom. Yet it was clear that his deepest connections were with powerful Ottoman figures and foreign nobles. He often used his body as a diplomatic offering, arranging luxurious gatherings where sexual favors and political deals were exchanged freely. These extravagant feasts at his court soon earned notoriety across the empire. Visitors came to expect indulgence in any desire, so long as they were willing to pay the price. The palace became synonymous with excess and vice, its reputation fueled by tales of its decadent atmosphere and open sensuality. Rado's governance of his Christian population highlighted how much he had adopted Ottoman traditions and views. The way he treated these subjects reflected not only his loyalty to his patrons, but also the profound changes in his values and identity after years immersed in foreign influence. He forced Orthodox churches to incorporate Islamic prayers into their services and required Christian nobles to learn Turkish. Muslim administrators were appointed to oversee Christian villages, while Ottoman taxation policies favored Turkish merchants, leaving his own people impoverished. Over time, his subjects began to view him not as their king, but as a puppet of the Turks, a man who had sold his soul for the sake of power. In 1475 AD, Radu's life came to a tragic end during an attempted reconciliation with his brother Vlad. Historical sources suggest that he was poisoned by his own nobles, who had grown increasingly disillusioned with his pro-Ottoman policies. His final words were allegedly spoken in Turkish, not Romanian, symbolizing his total cultural shift. His burial was conducted according to Islamic customs, despite his Christian upbringing, with his grave facing Mecca rather than Jerusalem. From the troubled lands of medieval Wallachia, we now turn to Baghdad, where a different ruler, Hakim by Amir Allah, came to power. Born around 995 AD, he ruled the Fatimid Caliphate from 996 to 1021 AD, with a reign marked by a mixture of religious zealotry and personal. His rule is remembered for being one of the most bizarre in history, a blend of fanaticism and strange behavior that set him apart from other rulers of the time. His reign was characterized by arbitrary bans, a fixation on architecture, and claims of divinity that highlighted a mind increasingly detached from reality. Al-Hakim ascended to the throne at the tender age of 11 after his father's passing, yet his upbringing was shaped by the influence of mystics and religious scholars. These figures filled his mind with apocalyptic visions and esoteric beliefs, leading him to the conclusion that he was a divine being, the final imam who would appear before the world's end. This delusion profoundly impacted his governance, with strange laws and erratic behavior toward his people. One of his first acts as ruler was to impose a ban on specific vegetables, convinced that certain strong-flavored foods tainted the soul. Onions, garlic, and leeks were forbidden across his realm, with harsh punishments meted out to those who defied the decree. This arbitrary ban was just the beginning of a series of increasingly strange prohibitions. He soon extended the restrictions to include grapes, honey, and a wide array of spices, creating a food system that left his citizens struggling to find suitable nourishment. The ban on these foods was only the tip of the iceberg. Al-Hakim's delusions of grandeur took an even darker turn as he enforced these laws with ruthless efficiency. The mere possession of forbidden foods became a criminal offense, punishable by imprisonment or worse. His obsession with purity and control grew so intense that his subjects lived in a constant state of fear, unsure of what would be banned next. The consequences of al-Hakim's reign were far-reaching. The once thriving economy faltered as trade in foodstuffs dwindled and farmers faced ruin due to the bans on essential crops. Meanwhile, al-Hakim continued to indulge in his architectural obsessions, commissioning grandiose palaces and monuments dedicated to his imagined divine status. His rule, marked by eccentricity and cruelty, left a kingdom broken both spiritually and physically. His belief was that tasteless food cleansed the soul and prepared followers for divine insight. Al-Hakim's fixation on dictating personal behavior led to a series of strange decrees affecting everyday routine. He forbade labor during daylight, claiming that night held greater spiritual purity than sunlight. Women were barred from leaving their homes except at designated times, and they were compelled to wear veils so dense that visibility was nearly impossible. He outlawed the production of women's footwear, asserting that the sound of female footsteps stirred lustful thoughts in men, disrupting their spiritual focus. His vision of society became increasingly rigid and isolated, with a growing emphasis on control over human instincts. These edicts spread fear and confusion among the people, who found themselves living under rules that seemed to defy logic or compassion. The caliph's monumental building endeavors reflected both his vanity and estrangement from reality. He initiated the Hall of Wisdom, which was supposed to become the world's most vast library, but the scope of the project was so unrealistic that it was ultimately left unfinished. Though he commanded the building of many mosques, he insisted they be designed exactly as he envisioned. Visions he claimed were directly inspired by divine messages. Despite his ambitions, few of his architectural dreams came to fruition. His insistence on perfection, based on imagined revelations, led to delays and failures. His rule, shaped by extreme mysticism and authoritarian control, left behind confusion rather than spiritual clarity, with grand but incomplete monuments to his unchecked power. Many of these structures were torn down and rebuilt repeatedly as he received new insights about how they should be designed. His approach toward religious minorities was a reflection of his volatile personality. He would alternate between persecuting and protecting Christians and Jews based on his mood and the latest mystical experiences he had. On one occasion, he ordered the destruction of all churches and synagogues within his realm, only to reverse this decision later and fund their restoration. He forced Christians to wear heavy wooden crosses and imposed distinctive clothing for Jews. However, these requirements were eventually lifted, and he even invited persecuted minorities to work in his administration. Al-Hakim's belief in his own divinity reached its peak when he proclaimed himself to be the ultimate incarnation of God on earth. He demanded that his subjects bow before him and commissioned religious scholars to compose texts that would prove his divine status. He asserted that he could perform miracles and maintained that his dreams were divine revelations, offering glimpses into God's will. His followers, who became known as the Druze, continue to revere him as a divine being. However, the majority of contemporary Muslims branded him as a dangerous heretic. In 1021 AD, the Caliph mysteriously vanished while journeying alone in the desert, a disappearance that remains unsolved. Some historians speculate he was killed by his own guards, while others suggest he faked his death to escape the weight of his rule. His blood-stained clothes were found on a hillside, but his body was never recovered. His disciples claimed he ascended to heaven, while his detractors celebrated his presumed demise. the truth of his fate was lost to the sands of the desert. From the mystical courts of medieval Cairo, the scene shifts to the harsh and unforgiving landscapes of 18th century Afghanistan. There, around 1722 AD, Ahmad Shah Durrani established the Durrani Empire. His rise to power was marked by a blend of military brilliance and personal traits that defined his leadership. Ahmad Shah's reign from 1747 to 1772 AD became infamous for his peculiarities, with many of his own troops finding his behavior so strange that it eventually became the stuff of legend. His reign was not only defined by his obsession with his appearance, but also by his strange collection of severed heads, which he regarded as his trusted advisors. The bizarre nature of his leadership led to stories that spread far beyond Afghanistan. Ahmad Shah's path to power was paved with violence. In 1747, he orchestrated the assassination of Nadia Shah of Persia, whom he had served as the commander of his Afghan bodyguard. Though he was in a position to be killed alongside his master, Ahmad's exceptional grooming habits and his legendary beard ensured his survival. Impressed by his appearance and meticulous care of his beard, Persian nobles allowed him to return to Afghanistan with a portion of Nadia's treasury. His grooming was not only a matter of vanity, but a powerful tool that helped secure his status. What set Ahmad Shah apart was his unrelenting fixation with his facial hair. This obsession went far beyond what would be considered ordinary grooming. Every morning, Ahmad would spend hours oiling and braiding his beard, which grew long enough to reach his waist. The level of care he put into his facial hair was unmatched, and it became central to his identity. He even employed a team of specialist barbers whose sole task was to wash, comb, and maintain his beard. They used imported oils and perfumes to ensure that not a single hair was out of place. His devotion to his beard reached such extremes that it became a symbol of his rule. The lengths to which he went to protect and perfect it became legendary, and it was said that no other part of his appearance could be altered without his permission. Even his severed head collection, which he regarded as wise counselors, did not attract as much attention as the daily ritual of beard maintenance, making him one of the most eccentric leaders in history. He believed that his beard was the source of his spiritual strength, and that any harm to it would lead to the downfall of his empire. Ahmad Shah's practice of collecting severed heads began as a military tradition, but it gradually turned into something far more unsettling. Following every victory, he would personally choose the heads of enemy commanders and preserve them using methods he had learned from Persian court physicians. These heads were then placed on stakes inside his tent, where he would engage in conversations with them before making any significant decisions. His officers often reported hearing him seek advice from the heads, as if they were his trusted military advisors. The king would inquire about strategy, listen to their silent responses, and make judgments based on their imagined counsel. This bizarre ritual became a central part of his daily routine. Before making any major decisions, whether political or military, he would turn to his collection of preserved heads for guidance, as though they formed a war council. Each head was carefully named according to the deceased's rank and achievements, reinforcing the illusion that they had become key figures in his decision-making process. Visitors to his court were often shocked to witness the king deep in conversation with the decayed skulls, their eye sockets hollow and their flesh mummified. It was as if he truly believed that these severed heads were still capable of offering him wisdom, nodding as he took their supposed advice seriously. Over time, his eccentricity grew more disturbing as he treated the skulls with a reverence that bordered on the religious. To outsiders, His behavior was a horrifying spectacle, a ruler so lost in his delusions that he relied on the voices of the dead to shape the fate of his empire. His troops grew convinced that their ruler could speak with the spirits of the dead. Just as unnerving was how he treated his living counselors. Ahmad Shah insisted on receiving counsel only from men whose beards had never been trimmed, certain that wisdom and mystic strength resided in uncut facial hair. He removed veteran commanders who maintained neat beards and elevated inexperienced officers purely based on the size and density of their beards. His royal council soon filled with men of dubious skill, whose chief qualification was the impressive growth on their faces. The king's battle strategies reflected his bizarre psychological quirks, often with terrifying results. Prior to engagements, he would parade a macabre collection of severed heads before the opposing troops, declaring that the spirits of fallen warriors would support his forces in combat. He firmly believed that these ghosts lent strength to his soldiers and demoralized the enemy. In battle, Ahmad Shah charged ahead with the preserved heads tied to his saddle, the eyeless skull swinging by ropes and appearing to glare at his opponents. The ghastly sight stirred terror and confusion among enemy lines, reinforcing his reputation for merging fear tactics with unorthodox spirituality. Under his rule, military campaigns became rituals of fear and spectacle. Strategy, planning, and merit took a back seat to theatrical intimidation and the eerie belief in spectral allies. While some victories were won through brute force and confusion, others were lost to incompetence and misplaced faith in beard-bound wisdom. This psychological strategy proved to be highly effective, as many of his adversaries chose to flee rather than confront an army commanded by a man with the ability to communicate with the dead. His obsession with personal hygiene was not limited to his beard, but extended to every aspect of his body. He bathed several times a day, using water sourced from specific mountain springs, firmly believing that cleanliness had a direct connection to military success. His hosiers were required to uphold the same level of cleanliness, making the Afghan army potentially the tidiest military force of its time. His foes often detected their arrival by the scent of soap and perfume, a stark contrast to the usual stench of unbathed soldiers. The death of Ahmad Shah in 1772 was as strange and peculiar as his life had been. He succumbed to cancer, yet in his final weeks he gave detailed instructions on how to preserve his head, hoping to offer guidance to his successors even after death. His son, Timashar, dutifully followed these instructions, keeping his father's preserved head in the royal palace for several years before finally burying it in accordance with traditional laws. The strange genius of Ahmad led to the rise of a vast empire, but that empire crumbled within a few decades. From the rugged mountains of Afghanistan, our journey took us to the opulent courts of 16th century. There, Akbar the Great, born in 1542 AD, reigned over the Mughal Empire from 1556 to 1605 AD. His rule was marked not by conquest alone, but by a curious blend of open-minded religious tolerance and personal eccentricity that made him one of history's most enigmatic leaders. Akbar's oddity was not rooted in brutality or indulgence, but rather in his intense fascination with unifying religions. He was consumed by the idea of forming a new spiritual system that drew from every belief he came across. His imperial court became an arena for theological debates, where scholars of all creeds gathered. Here, Akbar cast himself not just as emperor, but as a divine visionary, attempting to forge a path that transcended traditional boundaries of faith. This spiritual journey was shaped early by his diverse education. Akbar studied under an eclectic group of instructors, each representing a different religious background. Muslim clerics taught him the Quran, while Hindu gurus introduced him to ancient scriptures. He welcomed Jesuit priests from Europe, learned from Austrian scholars, and engaged with Buddhist monks, all in a quest to absorb knowledge without pledging loyalty to any single doctrine. Though he borrowed freely from many traditions, Akbar rejected their claims to sole authority. Instead, he sought universal truths that could unite people across division. His efforts culminated in the creation of a new creed, the Din-e-Ilahi, a faith that mirrored his unique vision, one born not of orthodoxy, but of an emperor's dream to harmonize humanity through shared spiritual insight. By the time he reached adulthood, Akbar had formed a critical worldview, believing that all religions were merely fragments of a single, greater divine truth that only he was capable of fully comprehending. In 1582 AD, he formalized his beliefs with the creation of the Din-e-Ilahi, or religion of God. This new faith marked the peak of his theological ambition. The religion was an eclectic blend of Islamic monotheism, Hindu concepts of reincarnation, Christian ethical teachings, and Zoroastrian fire worship. Akbar claimed that the entire system had been directly revealed to him by God. He declared himself the prophet of this new faith and instructed his most trusted courtiers to embrace the religion. However, he did not impose it on the general populace. His daily life became dominated by religious discussions, intellectual exploration. Akbar constructed the Abd Kanar House of Worship, a unique institution where representatives from various religious traditions could come together to engage in theological debates. Akbar would actively participate in these discussions, offering his interpretations and posing deep questions to the scholars and priests present. The debates at the Abd Kanar House could stretch for hours. Akbar would listen attentively to the viewpoints of the participants, probing them for their understanding of the divine. These sessions were not just about gathering knowledge, but about shaping Akbar's own evolving theories about the nature of God and the universe. He saw himself as a seeker of truth, continuously refining his beliefs through dialogue and reflection. During these debates, he meticulously took notes, which he later compiled into religious texts that laid the groundwork for his newly established faith. Akbar's approach to religious art exemplified his desire for synthesis. He ordered paintings that featured Hindu deities alongside Islamic calligraphy, Christian imagery paired with Buddhist symbols. His court artist created works that to orthodox followers of any religion would have seemed sacrilegious, yet Akbar viewed them as representations of universal truth. He also personally designed religious ceremonies that blended various traditions, creating rituals that both baffled and shocked visitors to his court. Akbar's matrimonial choices mirrored his inclusive religious philosophy. He married women from Hindu, Muslim, and Christian backgrounds, not merely for political gain, but to showcase the unity of diverse faiths. Under his reign, each of his wives was free to follow her own religion, and Akbar took part in their respective religious rituals, regarding them as distinct yet interconnected paths leading to the same divine truth. His reign became a symbol of religious tolerance, unlike anything seen before in the medieval world. The emperor's curiosity about intellectual pursuits shaped his governance style. He eliminated jizya, the tax on non-Muslims, and elevated individuals from religious minorities to important government positions. His administration prioritized merit and competence over religious identity, creating a progressive, inclusive environment. This approach made his empire a sanctuary for religious minorities, from across Asia, and his reputation as a tolerant ruler spread far beyond his borders, drawing persecuted communities to his court. Akbar's death in 1605 marked the conclusion of an extraordinary era of religious experimentation. His son, Jahangir, however, abandoned Akbar's policy of the Dana-i-Ilahi and returned to a more orthodox form of Islam. Despite this shift, the principles of religious tolerance that Akbar had instilled in the Mughal administration continued to shape policy for generations. Akbar's efforts to integrate various religious communities into his empire left a lasting legacy that influenced his successors, even as they navigated their own religious and political challenges. The emperor's tomb at Sikandra serves as a lasting tribute to his vision of unity among faiths. The architectural design of his mausoleum is a striking blend of Islamic, Hindu, and Christian elements. This fusion of styles not only reflects Akbar's personal beliefs in the harmony of all religions, but also symbolizes the broader vision of his empire, where diverse cultures and faiths coexisted in relative peace and mutual respect. The tomb stands as a monumental testament to his enduring influence. Akbar's policies were revolutionary in their time, establishing a model of governance that sought to transcend religious divides. His reign is remembered not just for military conquests, but for its groundbreaking efforts to create a more inclusive and tolerant society. The legacy of Akbar's religious and political reforms is one that continues to be remembered and admired, both in India and across the world. From the religious experiments of Mughal India, we now shift to the wind-swept highlands of Scotland. Here, David Datherword, born around his reign was marked by a striking blend of religious devotion and personal eccentricities, so extreme that they earned him sainthood, even as they drove his kingdom to the brink of bankruptcy. His obsession wasn't with accumulating power or indulging in earthly pleasures, but with establishing religious institutions and donating vast royal lands in the pursuit of his personal salvation. To him, his kingdom was akin to a grand monastery, with himself as the chief monk. David's religious fervor began in his youth at the Anglo-Norman court, where he encountered the monastic traditions of continental Europe and the Catholic Church's reform movement. Deeply influenced, he became convinced that royal power was a heavy burden that could jeopardize his soul unless it was devoted solely to religious purposes. This conviction shaped his later actions as king, leading him to pursue an ambitious agenda of monastery building across Scotland, a project that significantly transformed the nation. However, David's fervent commitment to this cause came at a steep cost. His relentless focus on religious institutions drained the royal treasury, putting the kingdom in financial peril. The vast lands he gifted to monasteries and churches further eroded his resources, and his single-minded pursuit of divine favor threatened the stability of his reign. Despite these challenges, his dedication to his religious vision remained unwavering. In the end, David's reign serves as a complex testament to the intersection of religious zeal and political power. While his actions nearly brought his kingdom to financial ruin, they also left a lasting legacy of monastic expansion and ecclesiastical reform in Scotland. His life continues to be remembered as one marked by a paradoxical blend of piety and fiscal imprudence, with the legacy of his devotion echoing through Scotland's religious landscape. His daily life was more akin to that of a monk than a sovereign. Rising before dawn, he began each day with private prayers, followed by attending several masses. His devotion to faith was unparalleled, as he spent long hours copying religious texts by hand. Beneath his royal attire, he wore a hair shirt, a sign of his self-imposed penance. His frequent fasting alarmed his courtiers, who grew increasingly concerned for his health. When it came to rest, he opted for a simple straw mattress in a modest cell, preferring a life of asceticism over royal luxury. His palace was filled with religious icons, not the indulgent trappings of a monarch. The king's dedication to religion was extraordinary, particularly in his mission to establish religious institutions. Throughout his 29-year reign, he founded more than 20 major monasteries and numerous smaller religious houses. In his zeal, he granted vast swaths of royal land to these institutions, often the most fertile and valuable in Scotland. These religious establishments became immensely wealthy, controlling nearly 1/3 of Scotland's land by the end of his reign. Remarkably, the church's wealth had surpassed that of the crown itself. David's commitment to the church also shaped his views on justice. His approach to governance was deeply influenced by his religious convictions, often making decisions based on his faith rather than the traditional norms of kingship. His reign was marked by a strict adherence to divine law, a guiding principle in both his leadership and personal life. He created church courts alongside the royal courts, frequently deferring to religious leaders in areas that had traditionally been under royal control. All of his officials were required to take religious vows, and he demanded that secular law align with church doctrine. His reign effectively turned the kingdom into a theocracy, with bishops holding more practical power than the nobles. The king's views on wealth reflected his deep religious convictions. He donated vast amounts of money to religious institutions, funding the construction of grand churches and monasteries, while neglecting the maintenance of his own castles. He refused to impose certain taxes, believing that the accumulation of royal wealth was spiritually harmful. At times, he personally gave alms to the poor, even offering his own clothes to beggars, much to the shock of his courtiers. His commitment to religious values was also evident in his marriage to Matilda of Huntingdon. The union was celebrated more like a sacred religious ritual than a typical royal wedding, emphasizing his devotion to the church over royal traditions. He was adamant that their relationship should remain abstinent, allowing only the bare minimum necessary to produce an heir. He regarded sexual pleasure as being in direct conflict with his spiritual aspirations, and as a result, the atmosphere in their court resembled a monastery more than a royal palace. Visitors often remarked that instead of the usual medieval festivities, the court was filled with continuous prayers, religious ceremonies, and theological debates. David's military campaigns were not driven by political ambition, but rather by religious fervor, with each battle resembling a crusade. His efforts focused on defeating pagan tribes along Scotland's borders, though his true objective was the conversion of these tribes rather than their subjugation. Before executing any, he always extended the offer of conversion to Christianity, seeking to save souls even in the face of conflict. His army, in fact, consisted of more priests than soldiers. David's death in 1153 AD occurred as he was deep in prayer within his private chapel. His passing was peaceful, and his last recorded words were a prayer for the souls of his enemies. When his body was discovered, he was found kneeling before a crucifix, a fitting end for a man whose life was dedicated to both faith and service. His hands were clasped in prayer. The Catholic Church later canonized him as Saint David I, recognizing his remarkable dedication. However, the kingdom he inherited was so weakened by his own boundless generosity that it took several generations to restore its royal authority. Our story then moves to the peculiar court of the Holy Roman Empire, under the rule of Rudolph II, born in 1552 AD. He reigned from 1576 to 1612, driven by an obsession with alchemy, astrology, and the occult, which turned his court into one of Europe's most bizarre intellectual centers. His reign was characterized by a complete retreat from the political realm, instead immersing himself in a world of magical beliefs and scientific inquiry, making him one of history's most eccentric monarchs. Rudolph II's descent into these obsessions can be traced back to his education in Spain. There, he was exposed to the writings of medieval alchemists and astrologers, which sparked his belief that the universe followed hidden laws, waiting to be uncovered through meticulous research and experimentation. Ki shon ying hongde, ongda bin kungde min, so Prague sinun po, tora konjan nor frukter va hintoa hartrun, demikonte fenbiet, lichtrin hangne, Gwer ong soy quan gustieze, alchemy wake pefting shem tingha, ongien hangye song fontieze briangwer ming, kugang chuna kimwe konchen ha gimwe konchen hage, ong chumir kagim alchemist, chim ting ja watonka ja, percha hu ni kum tin, hoklu the kan gu the kan yer gu the kan day, menu linka kaitri de tu, kate semla. Medididi di kun, lingo ongdi de kunding, to the more you the more you step boy, and yako hageli adams cum dat chabwa. Busruchup kilago hongde, the fedring sunnen, tongni busruchup ki kwaisa, tongyixit chabwa.
Hansu hu harian berjatran, sukjam yukaka, kashebi kaki, nanis like exeter, Yavragan Orden Tanisa, La Fritzet, Shimwondone, Countryland and Takvimitek, Kongukak Tongzon, Malane Vetfim on Sensa Mang Songmin in Quinlan Hen B.
He amassed what were believed to be unicorn horns, prophetic crystals that supposedly unveiled glimpses of the future, and mechanical devices that appeared to operate through mystical forces. His residence turned into a bizarre collection of the unexplainable, a gallery where observers struggled to tell authentic objects from cunning fabrications. Visitors wandered through rooms filled with marvels, unsure whether they were witnessing science or deception. Rudolph's behavior toward his inner circle mirrored his reliance on astrology and esoteric power. Major decisions were postponed until the stars aligned in his favor, and his counselors were only admitted after their horoscopes had been thoroughly examined. He favored mystics over statesmen, valuing rumored sorcery over proven skill. This practice encouraged a stream of illusionists and prophets from across the continent to converge upon his increasingly peculiar court. His preference for mysticism over rational judgment influenced the political and cultural atmosphere of his reign. Men and women who claimed contact with spirits or mastery of ancient spells often received high appointments, while practical administrators were sidelined. His strange priorities distorted the usual hierarchies, creating a palace ruled more by omens than order. Among his most notable associations was his partnership with the renowned astronomer Tycho Brahe. This alliance displayed his sincere passion for exploration and knowledge. It also highlighted his inability to separate true science from superstition. Brahe's achievements stood in stark contrast to the quacks who surrounded the emperor, but Rudolph treated them all with equal reverence. He provided Brahe with limitless resources for astronomical research, while also supporting astrologers who asserted they could predict the future through planetary movements. He saw mathematics and magic as the same, unable to distinguish between scientific investigation and mystical guesswork. The emperor's personal life grew more isolated as his obsessions took hold. He seldom appeared in public, preferring to spend all his time in laboratories and workshops. He never entered into marriage, arguing that romantic involvement would hinder his spiritual growth. Most of his communication with the public came in the form of written decrees, many of which were filled with astrological advice and alchemical ideas that confused their readers. In his later years, Rudolph's mental decline worsened as the chasm between his magical beliefs and the demands of governance widened beyond repair. He thought that his alchemical research was on the brink of a monumental discovery, but his empire was disintegrating around him. Religious conflicts ravaged his lands, yet he remained solely absorbed in the pursuit of the philosopher's stone. His people began to view him as a madman, obsessed with impossible goals rather than a ruler. Eventually, even his own family grew impatient and forced him to step down in favor of his more pragmatic brother. He died in 1612 AD, his life snuffed out while engrossed in another failed alchemical experiment. His hands were stained with chemicals, and his laboratory was littered with failed attempts at transmutation. Despite this, he left behind a treasure trove of artwork, one of Europe's finest collections, along with a legacy of supporting scientific endeavors. However, his empire was left in ruins, worn down by years of mismanagement and neglect. At his court, there existed a bizarre blend of intellectual triumphs and delusions, mirroring a mind that could no longer tell the difference between reality and fantasy. His obsession with alchemy, while yielding some fascinating results in the arts and sciences, ultimately blinded him to the crumbling world around him. Now, as you sit comfortably, perhaps reading this from your home, the stories of these 15 kings may seem distant, mere echoes from the past, neatly encapsulated in history books. But the corrupting nature of power remains ever present, whether it seeps through the ancient marble of Roman palaces or through the glass walls of today's corporate empires. The tools have evolved over time. Social media has replaced the stakes of power. Economic warfare has supplanted the need for biological weapons, and psychological manipulation has taken the place of religious terror. However, the core dynamics have remained constant. These individuals weren't monsters born from some dark mythical place. They were human beings, just like everyone else, capable of love and reason. Yet, absolute power turned them into figures unrecognizable, even to their own mothers. Their humanity dissolved in the corrosive effects of unchecked authority. They began life as innocent children, laughing, crying, and dreaming, only to evolve into nightmares that would torment their subjects long after death had taken them. The courtiers who bowed before a city on the brink of burning, the concubines who were consumed by their master's greed, and the peasants who starved while rulers built their monuments, all started with simple hopes: a meal, safety, perhaps a fleeting moment of happiness. These were people who at one point sought only the most basic comforts in life. Yet, as power grew, so did their capacity for cruelty. The image of them as innocent children faded, replaced by something far darker. They weren't born with malice in their hearts, but something within them twisted as they rose to power, and their dreams transformed into nightmares. From the moment they tasted authority, they began to see those beneath them as nothing more than tools to be used and discarded. What began as a yearning for a simple life devolved into an insatiable desire for control. The transformation wasn't sudden, but inevitable, driven by the very thing that had once made them human, the capacity to dream. Instead, they became players in tragedies, scripted by minds so twisted by power that they lost sight of their humanity. As you drift to sleep tonight, keep in mind that across the globe, power is still held in human hands. Remember that within every person who wields authority, there lies the potential for both creation and destruction. The only true distinction between the kings of old and today's leaders is that we've become better at hiding our monsters, masking our cruelties with the language of necessity and progress. Yet, in the quiet moments before slumber, when the thin veil of civilization begins to fade, and the whispers of absolute power grow louder, the spirits of these 15 kings linger around us. They serve as a reminder that the boundary between a ruler and a monster is drawn in sand, easily swept away by the winds of unchecked ambition and absolute control. In the end, they were all simply men who had forgotten what it meant to be human. Vakulas italas vetrud, zon sur isten sordeltoka.